much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Ashley.
So I'm going to start this interview with a few questions that I asked Martha in 2019 for our Q&A on my blog in celebration of the release of Lost Roses. So again, these are just sort of get to know you questions before we dive into the book. So author you draw inspiration from?
Oh my goodness. I'm so good with spontaneity. I love Jane Austen. I go back to her whenever I need some inspiration, just because I feel like she's still so relevant. I love E.B. White too. Lately, especially, my mother was a huge E.B. White fan, and whenever I miss her, I go back and read E.B. White.
I love that. Favorite place to read a book?
I would have to say in my office. Right now I'm in my apartment in New York City, but in my office at home in Connecticut, uh, it overlooks the mountains, and we live on a hay farm, so there's a beautiful vista. So I love to sit there, and it's just so calming, and look out while I read.
Book character you'd be best friends with?
This is so cliched, but I do think Lizzie from Pride and Prejudice. I know everyone says that, but it really is true. I love her. And I think we could talk books. We could hang out at Mr. Darcy's house. It would be fun, actually.
When it comes to writing, do you prefer pen and paper or computer?
If it's a really important scene, something either I'm having trouble with, or I just want to make sure that all the details are right, I definitely write it longhand and then transcribe it into the computer. Sometimes, I'll be driving along. I know this sounds crazy and very dangerous, but I'll write something while I'm driving. So, I've learned that when inspiration strikes you, you really just have to be ready.
So for those who have not read the book, let's dive into that by starting with a synopsis of this book's plot, and it's Sunflower Sisters.
Okay, it is a Civil War story. Well, Lilac Girls was a World War II novel, and then I went back in time with Lost Roses for Caroline's mother for World War I. We go back even further in time to look at Caroline Ferriday's Woolsey ancestors during the Civil War. And oh my goodness, I always knew that this was what I wanted to write about ever since I first started researching Caroline. But it is the story of Caroline's great-grandmother, Jane Eliza Woolsey. And she was an incredible matriarch of this family. She lost her husband very early on when her kids were very little in a terrible accident. He was killed while he was commuting from New York to Boston. In those days, they did that by sea, by steamer, and he was killed in a horrible accident at sea. So she had to raise these 8 children by herself, and she had 7 little girls, and an 8th child was born after Mr. Woolsey died, and it was a boy, the son that he never got a chance to see. So it's the story of one of these children, and it was hard choosing because all of Caroline's great aunts were unbelievably accomplished, but I chose the middle daughter, Georgeanna, because she had this dream to become a nurse, and she wanted to start a nursing school. And back then, I mean, that really surprised me in my research. Back then, it was a non-issue. Women did not write books, they did not speak out, none of that. It was really déclassé, and society would really ding you for that. So it's the story of Georgianne and how she goes about achieving her goal. They were all staunch abolitionists. So I thought that, in these books, I've done 3 characters every time, and I wanted to continue that for this last in the series. My books going forward, I think, will be a little different, but she was such a staunch abolitionist, and her whole family were abolitionists, that I thought one of the second characters definitely should be someone that was enslaved, and a woman, because I always write from the point of view of women. My second point of view character, I chose a girl enslaved on a tobacco plantation, a 16-year-old girl. And So for the third character, it just made sense to have a plantation mistress. Her name's Anne May in the book. And she's a brutal person, even though she's this young woman that should have, everything in the world to be happy about. She's just an unhappy person, and takes it out on these people that she has enslaved on her tobacco plantation. I really wanted to show the brutality and the reality of slavery, but also how New Yorkers like the Woolseys were dealing with that as well. So that's basically the story. They go about their lives during the Civil War, and it's a lot of twists and turns, because with war comes that. I think, in my other books, my readers have found that there's a lot going on in these wars with my characters, and women especially. And I think that by the time you get to the end, you feel like you've really lived through quite an experience.
One of the things that first appealed to me about your novels is how you found out about the Woolsey Ferriday family. So could you tell us about that Victoria Magazine article, your visit to the Bellamy Ferriday house, and how that led to these next 3 novels?
Yeah, it's so funny, isn't it? These little kind of serendipitous things that happen in our lives. And if I hadn't been a subscriber to Victoria Magazine, which I loved, and sadly it's no longer in print, I think they have it online, I never would have found out about Caroline and her incredible story. And it was just a single spread in Victoria Magazine, and the title of it was Caroline's Incredible Lilacs. And it had a little picture of her as a Broadway actress. I thought she was so beautiful, and a picture of the lilacs. And it was just a story about how she loved this summer home. They were New Yorkers originally, she and her family, her mother and father. Her father died when she was young, sadly. But yeah, it talked about the lilacs. And my mother had just passed away one Mother's Day, and I was really sad. And my husband said, why don't you go up and see that house? Because you've always wanted to see it. He meant the Bellamy Ferriday House and Gardens. It's a museum now. And I did. I thought, all right, he didn't have to ask me twice. I jumped in that car. I walked around the gardens that day, and just, lilacs were kind of my gateway to Caroline's story.
So readers of historical fiction often want to know what is fact and what is fiction. So can you tell us a little bit about any creative liberties you took while writing this book?
Well, I had a rule that if I knew for sure something was true, that I used it, because I do think that that historical truth really rings true in books. I think you really feel it when something is real. And one of the things that I wasn't sure about was Caroline's love life. And for the longest time, I resisted giving her a love interest because I wasn't sure where she stood with that. And then I met her former French maid. Caroline died in the mid-90s, but Cecile Bernard, her French maid, was still alive and living across the street from the Bellamy Ferriday house. And I used to go up there to research, and I always wanted to meet Cecile. And so finally I did get to meet her, and I asked her about that, about Caroline and boyfriends and things. And she said, oh, Caroline had a beau, and she told me about him and all sorts of things. So after that, I thought, oh, I can definitely give her a love interest now that I know that she had one. I don't know if I want it to be that exact guy, but I took that love interest and made him a little more interesting, the handsomest man in the world, I think it was. And that's what happened with Paul Rodier, how that came to be. She never married. So I felt like I didn't want to have that happen for her. I really tried to stay to the truth as much as I could.
So in reading all 3 of these novels, it is clear that you did extensive research. What is your research process for Sunflower Sisters, and which sources influenced you in what ways?
You know, the main source of research that I did, well, first of all, with the other books, I was very superstitious because Lilac Girls had been such a big hit. I wanted to do the same thing for Lost Roses, and I did a lot of traveling. I went to Russia and back to France and out to Long Island to research that book. So I thought, I need to do the same thing for Sunflower Sisters. And I was living in Atlanta at the time, and I went to all the plantations I could, former plantations, they're now museums, and went to Charleston to the slave market, which is now an incredible museum. Went to Magnolia Plantation, all the plantations around Atlanta and Charleston. And the Atlanta History Museum has an amazing collection of artifacts that I could walk there. So I really steeped myself in that, first of all. But then every chance I got, when I went up to the Bellamy Faraday house, I read the letters. Caroline was so proud of her Woolsey ancestry, and she was very careful to preserve all the letters and pictures. And she has archival boxes in her archives that contain 100 letters. It's just unbelievable. And I read them all. And that's why I have to wear glasses. But I got to know actually their handwriting even before I looked at the signature, because they were all so different. And I learned a lot from those letters. You would think that they would be kind of dull and uninteresting, but they were very funny, the women, and they all had kind of private jokes, and they were sarcastic, and it felt very much like I was reading somebody's emails or something.
What do you hope readers take away about slavery and the Civil War from reading Sunflower Sisters?
Wow. I hope they realize that we're kind of going through that again. We are in some ways just as divided as we always are. And I think in the book you see why. I don't talk that much. It's a theme for sure that runs through it, but I think that people will find a lot of it familiar, that could still be happening today. The draft riots, for example. It was this insurrection, this mob took over New York City of Irish people, and they were angry that free Black men were not being sent to war, not being drafted, but they were. And that wealthy white men were able to pay a fee to be able to get someone else to fight for them. So they were angry, and they took it out on New York City. They went after the New York Times office. They dragged out white owners of shops that sold things to Black people and did terrible things to them. They lynched Black men. There's some reports that they lynched a child. And they got what they wanted. They ended up, the government ended up saying, okay, well, we're gonna change the draft rules. So there are a lot of things in the book like that you go, wow, some of those things are just like today.
How do you know when you've done enough research to suffice the story, but not so much that you get lost down the rabbit hole of research and never actually start writing?
I think, I always rate the book that I want to read, and I don't like a lot of exposition. Narrative summary. I like it. I like to get my history in the form of action and dialogue, and I just want to be swept away by it. And if I learn stuff, fine. But a lot of that is just backstory in a way. In my head, I don't have to put on the page every single little thing. But I think the reader feels it when you only pick the most important parts.
So I was struck by the number of characters in this book, particularly in the Woolsey family. And you mentioned before that there were 8 siblings, 7 daughters and a son. And you have a cheat sheet to the Woolsey women for readers on your website. How did you keep all of these characters organized in your head? Did you use the cheat sheet while writing?
I did. There's a wonderful book called Letters of My Heart Toward Home, or My Heart Toward Home. And it's a great companion book to Sunflower Sisters because it is the letters that Eliza Woolsey, who is Georgeanna's best friend and younger sister, she compiled that book. And in the back of it, there are photographs of each of the sisters. So for a long time, when I first started, I would have to keep that book with me and look at the pictures just to go, okay, wait, who is this? Because sometimes the letters were signed by just initials. And I would have to go match up the initials to, who it was. After a while, I got pretty good at it, but I think that, it's not like Little Women where there's just 4 sisters. This is 7 sisters. And it does take a little bit to keep them all. I focus on some more than others. For example, Eliza is Georgeanna's best friend, and they do a lot together. They become nurses together, and they do a lot together. So I focus on her a lot. And some of the other ones are more just kind of ancillary characters. Mary, I think, has kind of a center stage, being the beauty. Got to get her in there.
I wrote my dissertation on World War II war brides, so I tend to gravitate towards that time period when selecting books. So you hooked me with Lilac Girls and then got me to read about other time periods with your subsequent books. You've now written about 3 different generations and time periods: the Civil War, World War I, and World War II. Do you have a favorite time period to write about?
The Civil War was fresh for me, and even World War I was different, and I loved that. And Russia and the Bolsheviks and everything. But the Civil War, I think, would have to be my favorite, and maybe because it's our war. This book was so personal. Writing about the Nazis was in some ways easy because the conflict in that, they were so horrible. But the Civil War is so interesting because it was our war. And, it's a cliche, brother against brother. But when you really think about it, to fight against your own family, people in your own family. And that is what happens in this book. Anne May's husband, Fergus, who she's a little lukewarm about, goes off to fight on the opposite side of her brother and her beloved brother. And I can't tell you what happens, but I just think that it's a really it's way more personal. I think also the fact that I got to walk around the Gettysburg battlefield, it's such an emotional, it's heartbreaking walking around there, thinking that the remains of some of these men might still be there. But I think once you look at a war from the perspective of women and what was happening, kind of personally to women during it, I think it gets much more interesting.
Did your process change between writing and publishing your first novel to this one?
The process. Yes, I started as a pantser. I don't know. Yeah, you know what a pantser is. I don't know if everyone does. A pantser is someone that writes just from the seat of their pants. And that's what I did when I first started. I had no idea what I was doing. In a way, it's good. For me anyway, it was good that I started that way because otherwise I would have been way too intimidated. But I did realize as time went on that I needed an outline. And that was a real revelation because Lilac Girls took me 10 years to write, I think in part because I kept writing stuff and then throwing it out going, well, that doesn't work. And then I realized this is historical fiction. It has to line up with an actual timeline. So I started doing these giant timelines on this giant poster or newsprint, and each character and, very detailed scene wise what happens, because I love to write in scenes. And so once I did that, it just made things so much easier.
Have you ever abandoned a story because you just couldn't make it work?
A whole story?
Or even like a character story and just like thrown that it wasn't?
Definitely. Not a whole, usually, I've only written 3 books and I'm on my 4th, but no, so far I haven't abandoned a whole story. But I have definitely abandoned scenes because people talk about writer's block, and I've definitely had that. But I think if the scene is a really good one and it has all the elements that you need for a really good scene, a goal and conflict and a disaster, I think if it's got that, you should be okay. But if it's not working, a lot of people might say that that's writer's block, but I just think the scene isn't uh, a good scene. I think that's okay. And then for me anyway, I will abandon that and say, what else would be more interesting? Oftentimes it's because the setting's boring or, there are a lot of reasons, or maybe the engine's just not there. There's not enough kind of conflict, or it doesn't matter. Sometimes scenes just, you think it's a good idea, like, oh, I think I'll do this in a scene, and then it just isn't great. Other scenes, you start writing them and you go, oh, wow, this is much better than I thought.
In the author interviews that I've done, authors tend to fall into one of two camps. Either they love the blank page and just spitting the story out that first go round, but then kind of dread the editing process, or they kind of dread getting it all out on that blank page and then love grappling with a story that's written and making it better. Do you fall into one of those two camps or somewhere in between?
Oh, yes. Definitely the latter. It's hard because in some ways I love the blank page. I mean, there's that tingle of, what's going to happen. I know that it's going to be great, but you just don't know what it's going to be. I think that kind of unknowing is a little terrifying, because you figure it's going to, something is going to be wonderful, but there's no guarantee that a book's going to be good. So far, I feel like I haven't had anything to worry about in that way, but I think there's always that kind of insecurity of, is this going to be as good as I thought it was going to be? And I absolutely love editing, love, love, love. Like in my fourth book right now, I'm at the part where all the characters are in, all the scenes are in, and I'm just going back and reading it over and over again and making sure that everything is really, that invisible thread draws you along, because I like that in a book. I really like a good cliffhanger. I know they're corny, but I love them. And I feel like if all of those things are working as you go along, you've got a great book. And so I'm much more confident now when I look at that blank page, but that is definitely the hardest part, to just like kind of create these characters and create scenes and just do the physical writing, getting in that, recliner and putting words on the page.
So we talked a little bit about what inspired the first book, Lilac Girls, and inspired you to become an author. What were you doing prior to that?
Well, I had retired. I had been an advertising copywriter, writing TV commercials and print ads, and I never felt like I was that good at it. I loved the writing part of it, but I was always writing continuing characters into my salad dressing commercials and my rice commercials. And it was just, I don't know why my boss didn't just go, or my bosses just go, would you stop? I had retired from that. I had 3 children, and the third one was a boy, and he was quite large, and he kicked the slats out of his crib and walked out. I think I kept him in there too long, but it was a handful. And I just thought, I cannot keep working. I have to stay home with these kids. So I became a stay-at-home mom, and there were wonderful things about it, but I did miss having a career. And I thought, well, this is it for me. My mom had passed away by then, and she had always said, well, you're the writer in the family. And I guess I just thought, well, I guess, I'm not really. That was, being, to me, a copywriter is not really being a writer. But I didn't think about, how do you become a creative writer? That just was foreign to me. I felt something was lacking. And I also was very jealous of people that had these passions in their lives. And I thought, why do I not have something that I'm passionate about? And then, so when this happened to me, it literally happened to me when I stumbled on this at the house. I was ready, I think, and I took it from there.
So you've been an author for several years now, 3 books with a 4th on the way. What is the most difficult part about being an author? And then on the flip side, what is your favorite part?
My least favorite part about being an author, it is not being able to go out on a book tour. That is one of my favorite parts of the whole process, is going out and meeting everybody. From my last book, Lost Roses, Random House sent me on this unbelievable tour, and I went everywhere, and it was so much fun. You spend so much time as an author at a desk, just in by yourself in a vacuum. And so it's just that the yin to the yang, and getting out there and getting a little of the benefit of that, of having people say, hey, I like this character, or thank you for writing, or, this helped me in my life. That I feel is kind of the reward. So to me, not being able to do that this time is really, really not good. But in terms of process, I guess it's that first putting the characters on the page. But when you say what's your least favorite part, I really like all of it. That's just, of liking things, what I like least, if that makes sense. And then what I like the most, oh my goodness. Oh, wow. I guess in terms of process, it is getting to the very end and having my editor read it and working with her on ways to make it even better, because she's so good. And she takes the characters, and she has from the very first day. She acts like they're human. And so it's really fun to have that first editorial letter, they call it, and to talk with her about it, because oftentimes it's all stuff that I kind of know in my heart, that she'll say, I'm not sure if there's enough of this character, or this relationship doesn't really work, or we need more. Like in Lost Roses, she said, we need more Paris. I was like, yes, I need to go back to Paris. So I think that's the fun part, is exposing it, because it takes at least a year or so to write a book, and in that time you're falling in love with these characters, and you get to finally expose them to your editor. It's a really, really fun time.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. I want to remind all the viewers there are copies of Sunflower Sisters available at the Novel Neighbor.
Thank you so much, Ashley. You're amazing. I can't wait to do this again.
I would love to, and I hope it's in person next time.
Fingers crossed.
Yes.